I stood in front of the warped mirror in our cramped apartment bathroom, fumbling with the knot of my tie. The dim light flickered overhead, casting shadows that danced across my reflection. My fingers trembled slightly, not from the cold, though the February air seeped through the thin walls, but from the weight of what lay ahead. The Magnolia Room. The Harpers. Emily's family. I could already feel their eyes on me, dissecting every word, every gesture. I tugged the tie tighter, too tight, and winced as it bit into my neck. A deep breath. Another. It didn't help. You ready? Emily's voice drifted in from the bedroom, soft but laced with that quiet strength I'd come to lean on. I stepped out, smoothing my jacket, an old hand-me-down from my dad that still smelled faintly of tobacco and cedar. She stood by the window, silhouetted against the glow of the streetlights, her auburn hair catching the light like embers. She wore a simple black dress, elegant in its restraint, but her posture betrayed her nerves. Her shoulders were squared, her jaw set. She was ready for battle, even if she wouldn't admit it. As I'll ever be, I said, forcing a smile. You sure they won't eat me alive? She crossed the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood, and adjusted my tie with a practiced hand. They might try, she said, her lips twitching into a smirk. But I've got your back, James Carter. Always. That name, Carter, felt heavier tonight than it ever had. It was just a name, I'd told myself 1,000 times. A working-class name, tied to a high school history teacher with no pedigree to speak of. But with the Harpers, it wasn't just a name. It was a liability. The drive to the Magnolia Room was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the space where words should have been. Downtown loomed ahead, all glass and steel, a world that didn't belong to me. The restaurant itself was a relic of old money, red brick walls draped in ivy, windows that glowed like embers against the night. I parked our beat-up sedan between a gleaming BMW and a polished Lexus, and the contrast hit me like a fist. Emily squeezed my hand as we stepped out, her touch grounding me, but my stomach churned all the same. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of leather and bourbon, the kind of place where deals were made over steaks and secrets were traded like currency. The hostess led us through a maze of white tablecloths and murmured conversations, her heels clicking a rhythm I couldn't match. My eyes darted to the chandeliers overhead, the oil paintings on the walls, scenes of fox hunts and plantation houses, a past I'd only read about in textbooks. Emily's hand brushed mine again, a silent reminder to breathe. The Harpers were already seated at a long table near the back, a wall of power in tailored suits and pearls. Bill Harper, Emily's father, dominated the space without even standing, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and eyes like a hawk. Beside him sat Margaret, her mother, her smile as sharp as cut glass. Emily's brother, Daniel, lounged with the ease of someone born into this world, his tie loosened just enough to signal he didn't have to try. And then there was Claire, the youngest, her gaze flicking over me like I was something she'd scrape off her shoe. Emily, darling, Margaret said, rising to kiss her daughter's cheek. Her voice was honeyed, but her eyes slid to me, cool and appraising. And James. So good of you to join us. I nodded, my throat dry. Thank you for having me, Mrs. Harper. Margaret, please, she corrected, though the warmth didn't reach her face. Bill extended a hand, his grip crushing, and I forced myself not to flinch. Sit, he said, more command than invitation. I took the chair beside Emily, the leather creaking under me, and felt the room shrink. The table stretched out like a battlefield, each fork and knife a weapon I didn't know how to wield. So, James, Bill began, leaning back as a waiter poured wine I wouldn't dare touch. Emily tells me you're a teacher. History, is it? Yes, sir, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. High school. 11th grade. He nodded, slow and deliberate, like a judge weighing evidence. Honest work. Not much money in it, though. The words landed like a slap, casual but cutting. I clenched my jaw, heat creeping up my neck. It's not about the money, I said, meeting his gaze. It's about the kids. Giving them something real. Real, he echoed, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Admirable. But reality's a tough sell when the bills come due. Emily's hand found mine under the table, her fingers tightening. James is brilliant at what he does, she said, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. Not everyone measures worth in dollars, Dad. Bill raised an eyebrow, but before he could reply, Daniel cut in. Oh, come on, Em. Don't get all righteous. We're just making conversation. Conversation. Right. It felt more like an interrogation, every question a probe to find the cracks. I shifted in my seat, the room pressing in, the clink of glasses and low laughter from other tables amplifying the tension. I wanted to fire back, to tell them I didn't need their approval, but the truth gnawed at me. I did. For Emily's sake, I did. Margaret sipped her wine, her eyes never leaving me. And your family, James? What do they do? The question hung there, innocent on the surface, lethal underneath. I pictured my parents, Dad with his calloused hands from years at the hardware store, Mom balancing books for small businesses out of our dining room. Good people. Honest people. But to the Harpers, they'd be nothing more than a footnote. My dad's retired, I said, keeping it vague. Mom does accounting part-time. They're simple folks. Simple, Claire repeated, her voice dripping with something I couldn't quite name. That's sweet. Anger flared in my chest, hot and sudden. I opened my mouth, but Emily beat me to it. They're hardworking, she said, her eyes flashing. And kind. Qualities this family could use more of. The table went still, the air crackling. Bill's smirk faded, and Margaret's smile tightened. I felt a surge of pride and dread. Emily could fight her own wars, but I was the outsider here, the one they'd aim at when the dust settled. The waiter arrived with the first course, breaking the silence, but the weight didn't lift. I stared at the plate, some delicate arrangement of greens and sauce I didn't recognize, and felt the gap between us widen. This wasn't just dinner. It was a test. And I wasn't sure I'd pass. The clatter of silverware against porcelain filled the silence as the first course was cleared away, but the tension at the table only thickened. Bill Harper leaned forward, swirling the Bordeaux in his glass, the deep red catching the chandelier's light like blood. His eyes locked on mine, sharp and unrelenting, and I felt the air shift. Something was coming, something I wouldn't dodge. So, James, he said, his voice smooth but edged with a blade, teaching's noble and all, but let's cut to it. What's the salary these days for a high school history teacher? 35 grand? 40, tops? He smirked, a slow, deliberate curl of his lip, and took a sip of wine, letting the question hang there like a guillotine. The room tilted. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the murmurs from the other tables. I gripped the edge of my chair, the leather slick under my palms, and fought to keep my face steady. 40 grand. He wasn't far off, and that stung worse than the condescension dripping from his tone. I'd always known the number was small, hell, I lived it every month, stretching checks to cover rent and groceries, but hearing it tossed out like that, in this gilded cage of wealth, made it feel like a brand on my skin. Dad, Emily snapped, her voice slicing through the haze. She sat up straighter, her hand slipping from mine to rest on the table, fingers splayed like she was ready to push back. That's enough. Bill didn't flinch. He set his glass down, the clink loud in the sudden stillness, and tilted his head. Just a question, Emily. Man's got to know his worth, doesn't he? My worth. The words burned, igniting a coal of anger deep in my chest. I opened my mouth, tasting the defiance on my tongue, but Margaret beat me to it. Oh, Bill, don't tease, she said, her laugh light and brittle, like cracking ice. I'm sure James does wonderfully with what he has. What I have. The pity in her voice was worse than Bill's smirk. I glanced at Emily, her jaw tight, her eyes blazing, and felt a surge of something fierce and reckless. I wasn't here to be their punching bag. Not tonight. It's enough, I said, my voice low but steady, locking eyes with Bill. Enough to live on. Enough to matter. I don't need a six-figure paycheck to sleep at night. The table froze. Daniel let out a low whistle, leaning back with a grin, like he'd just bought tickets to a show. Claire smirked into her napkin, but Bill didn't move. His gaze bored into me, searching for a crack, and for a split second, I saw something flicker there. Not respect, not yet, but surprise. Maybe irritation. Good. Emily's hand found mine again under the table, her grip fierce, and I clung to it like a lifeline. James doesn't have to prove anything to you, she said, her tone cold and final. He's here because I asked him to be. Bill's smirk returned, thinner this time, and he raised his glass in a mock toast. Well, then, he said. To noble causes. The words hit like a slap, but before I could fire back, my phone buzzed in my pocket, sharp and insistent. I fumbled for it, grateful for the excuse, and glanced at the screen. Thomas Carter. My uncle. Odd timing, he rarely called, especially not this late. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the decline button, but something in my gut twisted. I stood, murmuring an apology, and stepped away from the table, Emily's worried glance trailing me. I slipped into the hallway, the restaurant's hum fading behind the heavy oak doors, and answered. Uncle Thomas? James, his voice crackled through, urgent and clipped. You at that dinner with the Harpers? Yeah, I said, frowning. How'd you, listen, he cut in. Harper Development's pushing a $50 million loan through my foundation. I need to know what they're saying about it. Right now. My stomach dropped. 50 million. The Carter Foundation. The pieces didn't fit, my uncle ran a small nonprofit, or so I'd thought. I pressed the phone harder to my ear, my mind racing. What are you talking about? What foundation? A pause, then a low chuckle. Boy, we've got a lot to catch up on. Just get me what I need. I'll explain later. The line went dead. I stood there, the cold wood paneling pressing against my back, staring at the phone like it might bite. The Harpers. My uncle. $50 million. My world tilted again, sharper this time, and I didn't know if it was anger or fear clawing up my throat. All I knew was that dinner wasn't just a test anymore, it was a trap. And I'd walked right into it. I stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway of the Magnolia Room, the weight of Thomas's words sinking into me like damp rot through old wood. $50 million. The Carter Foundation. My uncle's voice still echoed in my head, sharp and commanding, as if he'd just handed me a live grenade and walked away. The polished oak walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the faint tang of cigar smoke and polished leather drifting from the dining room. My phone felt hot in my hand, a silent conspirator in whatever game was unfolding. I didn't understand it, not yet, but one thing was clear, I couldn't go back to that table the same man I'd been 5 minutes ago. The heavy doors loomed ahead, a barrier between me and the Harpers' smug scrutiny. My tie felt tighter, strangling me, and I loosened it with a trembling hand. My mind raced. Thomas hadn't just called to chat. He wanted something. Information. Leverage. And I was supposed to get it from Bill Harper, a man who'd spent the night slicing me open with every word. The thought made my stomach twist, a sour mix of dread and fury. I wasn't a spy. I wasn't a player in their world. I was a damned history teacher, for God's sake. But then I thought of Emily, her fierce grip on my hand, her voice cutting through her father's condescension like a blade. She'd stood up for me in there, taken the hits alongside me. If Thomas was right, if the Harpers were tangled up in some scheme with my family, she deserved to know. I deserved to know. I straightened, shoving the phone back into my pocket, and pushed through the doors. The dining room hit me like a wall, warm light glinting off crystal, the low hum of wealth and power wrapping around me again. The Harpers' table came into view, and I felt their eyes snap to me before I'd even taken 2 steps. Bill sat at the head like a king on his throne, his broad shoulders filling the space, his glass of Bordeaux still cradled in his hand. Margaret's smile flickered, thin and brittle, as she watched me approach. Daniel slouched with that same lazy grin, and Claire's gaze darted over me, sharp and predatory. Emily turned last, her brow creasing with worry as she caught the stiffness in my stride. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with something urgent. She knew me too well, knew the way my jaw tightened when I was rattled. "Yeah," I lied, sliding back into my seat. "Just my uncle. Family stuff." The words felt flimsy, but I forced a smile, hoping it'd hold. Her hand brushed my arm under the table, a quiet anchor, but it didn't stop the storm churning inside me. Bill cleared his throat, setting his glass down with a deliberate clink. "Family stuff," he repeated, his tone mockingly curious. "Hope it's nothing serious. Wouldn't want you distracted from our little chat." The jab landed, and I felt the heat rise in my chest again. He wanted me rattled, wanted to keep me on the ropes. I clenched my fists under the table, nails digging into my palms. "No distraction," I said, meeting his gaze. "Just catching up. You know how it is, family business can get complicated." His eyes narrowed, just a fraction, but enough to tell me I'd struck something. Good. If Thomas was right about this loan, Bill Harper wasn't the only one with cards to play. I leaned back, mirroring his posture, and let the silence stretch. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, like the moment before a storm breaks. Margaret broke the tension with a light laugh, her pearls glinting as she tilted her head. "Oh, I'm sure it's nothing compared to running a company like Harper Development. Bill's been buried in meetings all week, haven't you, dear?" "Meetings," Bill grunted, his smirk returning. "And loans. Big ones. Keeps the wheels turning." There it was. My pulse quickened, Thomas's voice flashing through my mind, $50 million loan application star. I kept my face steady, but my thoughts spun. Was he baiting me? Did he know I'd just talked to Thomas? No, he couldn't. Not yet. I seized the opening anyway. "Loans, huh? Big money like that must take some serious pull. Who's backing it?" Bill's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, and I felt a jolt of satisfaction. He took a slow sip of wine, buying time, then set the glass down with a soft thud. "The usual players," he said, his voice casual but laced with steel. "Banks. Investors. People who know a good deal when they see one." "Must be nice," I said, keeping my tone light, probing. "Having that kind of trust. 50 million's no small ask." The table went still. Emily's hand froze on my arm, her breath catching. Bill's eyes locked on mine, cold and unblinking, like a hawk spotting prey. I'd overplayed it, too specific, too fast. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I held his stare, refusing to blink. 50 million, he said slowly, rolling the words like he was tasting them. "That's a hell of a guess, James. You got a source feeding you numbers?" The air turned to ice. Margaret's smile vanished, and Daniel sat up, his grin fading. Claire's fork hovered over her plate, her eyes darting between us. Emily's grip tightened, her nails digging into my sleeve. I could feel the trap closing, but I couldn't back down, not now. Just a hunch, I said, forcing a shrug. You talk big, I figure the numbers match. Am I close? Bill didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his presence filling the space like a physical weight. You're a curious one, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Curiosity's a hell of a thing. Can get you places, or get you burned. The threat hung there, raw and unspoken, and I felt the first real stab of fear. Not just for me, for Emily, for whatever Thomas had dragged me into. I opened my mouth, searching for a deflection, when my phone buzzed again, louder this time, cutting through the silence like a gunshot. I fumbled it out, my hands slick with sweat, and saw Thomas's name flashing on the screen. Bill's eyes flicked to it, then back to me, and I knew he'd seen it too. Better take that, he said, leaning back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Family business, right? I stood, my chair scraping against the floor, and muttered an excuse as I bolted for the hallway again. Emily's voice called after me, sharp with worry, but I didn't stop. The doors swung shut behind me, muffling the dining room's hum, and I answered the call, my voice a harsh whisper. What the hell, Thomas? James? His voice boomed through the line, louder than before, crackling with urgency. Good news, kid, the loan's approved. 50 million, locked and loaded. Harper Development's in deep now, and they don't even know who's holding the leash. I froze, my back against the wall, the cold seeping through my jacket. The words hit me like a punch, approved. The Carter Foundation wasn't just some small-time outfit. Thomas had power, real power, and he'd just dropped it in my lap. I glanced back at the doors, picturing Bill's smug face, and felt a surge of something dark and electric. Anger. Defiance. Maybe even vengeance. What do you mean, who's holding the leash? I hissed, my mind reeling. What am I supposed to do with this? Thomas laughed, a rough, triumphant sound. You're in the room, James. You tell me what they're thinking. And then we figure out how to twist the knife. The line went dead again, leaving me alone in the shadowed hallway, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I wasn't just a teacher anymore. I was a pawn, or maybe a player, in a game I didn't understand. And back at that table, Bill Harper was waiting, his eyes already sharpening for the kill. The hallway felt like a cage, the oak walls pressing in as I clutched the phone, Thomas's last words looping through my head, * twist the knife star. My breath came shallow, fogging in the cool air, and the faint hum of the dining room seeped through the heavy doors behind me. I could still see Bill Harper's face in my mind, that cold, predatory smirk as he'd watched me scramble for the call. He knew something was off. He had to. And now I was standing here, armed with a secret I didn't fully grasp, my uncle's cryptic orders buzzing like hornets in my skull. The phone trembled in my hand, the screen still glowing with Thomas's name before it faded to black. $50 million. Approved. The Carter Foundation, my Carter Foundation, or so it seemed, had just locked Bill Harper into a deal he didn't see coming. My chest tightened, a strange cocktail of fear and exhilaration surging through me. All night, I'd been the prey, dodging Bill's barbs, swallowing my pride for Emily's sake. But now? Now I had something he didn't. Leverage. Power. The thought tasted bitter and sweet all at once, like blood and honey mixing on my tongue. I straightened, shoving the phone into my pocket, and turned back toward the doors. My hand hovered over the brass handle, the metal cold against my skin, and I froze. What was I walking into? Bill's eyes would be waiting, sharp and searching, ready to carve me apart the second I slipped. Emily would be there too, her worry etched into every glance, and I'd have to lie to her, again, because I didn't even know what the truth was yet. The Harper's world stretched out beyond those doors, a labyrinth of wealth and deceit, and I was about to step deeper into it, armed with nothing but a half-heard conversation and a growing knot of defiance. The doors swung open with a soft creak, and the dining room swallowed me whole. The air hit me first, warm, heavy with the scent of seared meat and aged wine, the kind of richness that clung to your clothes and reminded you where you didn't belong. The chandeliers cast their golden glow over the table, glinting off the Harper's polished surfaces, Bill's cufflinks, Margaret's pearls, Claire's diamond studs. They were a fortress of privilege, and I was the crack in the wall, widening with every step I took. Emily's head snapped up as I approached, her eyes locking on mine, wide with questions she didn't voice. I forced a nod, a silent "I'm fine," but the tightness in her jaw told me she wasn't buying it. Bill leaned back in his chair, his broad frame filling the space like a storm cloud, his glass of Bordeaux twirling lazily in his hand. "Well," he said, his voice a low drawl, thick with amusement. "Family business sorted?" The words dripped with mockery, and I felt the heat flare in my chest again. Anger, yes, but something sharper now, something dangerous. I slid into my seat, the leather creaking under me, and met his gaze. For now, I said, keeping my tone even, though my pulse hammered against my ribs. Just some loose ends. Loose ends, he echoed, his smirk sharpening. Funny how those pile up when you least expect it. Margaret laughed, a tinkling sound that grated against my nerves. Oh, Bill, don't be dramatic. I'm sure James has it all under control. Her eyes flicked to me, cool and appraising, like she was sizing up a horse at auction. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to snap back. Under the table, Emily's hand found mine, her fingers threading through my own, and I clung to the warmth of her touch. She didn't say a word, but the pressure of her grip told me she felt it too, the shift, the tension coiling tighter with every breath. I wanted to pull her aside, spill everything Thomas had said, but not here, not under Bill's hawkish stare. Daniel broke the silence, leaning forward with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. So, James, what's the word from the Carters? Anything juicy? The question landed like a punch, and I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. Did he know? No, he couldn't. It was just a dig, another jab at the outsider. I forced a laugh, dry and brittle. Just my uncle checking in. He's persistent. Persistent, Bill said, rolling the word like he was tasting it. That's one way to put it. Carters, huh? Small world. My stomach twisted. Small world. Did he mean something by it, or was I reading shadows where there were none? I glanced at Emily, her brow creasing again, and felt a pang of guilt. She deserved the truth, whatever it was, but I couldn't give it to her yet. Not until I understood it myself. Before I could respond, Bill set his glass down with a deliberate clink, the sound cutting through the murmur of the room. Speaking of persistence, he said, his tone shifting, all business now, we've got some good news of our own. Harper Development's loan just came through. Big one. 50 million, locked in this afternoon. The words hit me like a freight train, and for a split second, I forgot how to breathe. 50 million. Approved. Thomas's voice roared back into my head, asterisk they don't even know who's holding the leash star. My eyes darted to Bill, searching his face for a crack, a hint that he knew more than he was letting on. But he just sat there, smug and unshaken, his broad hands splayed on the table like a conqueror claiming his prize. Margaret clapped her hands, her smile widening. Oh, that's wonderful, dear. All that hard work paying off. Hard work and good connections, Bill said, his gaze sliding to me, lingering just long enough to make my skin crawl. You'd be surprised how far a name can carry you. A name. My name. Carter. The room spun, the edges blurring as Thomas's revelation clawed its way to the surface. The Carter Foundation had approved the loan, my uncle had approved it, and Bill Harper was sitting there, gloating, oblivious to the noose tightening around his empire. Shock coursed through me, cold and electric, followed by a surge of something darker, anger, yes, but laced with a hunger I hadn't felt before. They'd spent all night tearing me down, measuring me against their gilded yardstick, and now I held a piece of their world in my hands. Emily's voice pulled me back. That's great, Dad, she said, her tone flat, almost mechanical. She squeezed my hand harder, her nails digging in, and I knew she'd caught the shift in me, the way my shoulders stiffened, the way my breath hitched. James, you okay? I nodded, forcing a smile that felt like a mask. Yeah. Just surprised. That's a hell of a number. Bill chuckled, a low rumble that set my teeth on edge. Hell of a number indeed. Keeps the machine running. You'll see how it works one day, James, assuming you stick around. The barb stung, but it didn't land the way it would have an hour ago. I leaned back, mirroring his posture again, and let the silence stretch. My mind raced, piecing it together, Thomas's urgency, Bill's arrogance, the loan tying them together in a knot I could pull tight if I dared. The fear was still there, gnawing at me, but it was drowned out by a growing resolve. I wasn't just surviving this dinner anymore. I was in it, deep, and I wasn't backing out. Emily tugged at my sleeve, her voice a whisper. Hey, let's step out for a sec. I need air. I glanced at her, her green eyes searching mine, and nodded. Bill raised an eyebrow as we stood, but he didn't stop us. Don't be long, he said, his tone light but edged with warning. We've got dessert coming. We slipped into the alcove just off the dining room, a narrow nook framed by velvet curtains and a single sconce casting a soft glow. The noise of the restaurant faded, leaving only the sound of our breathing. Emily turned to me, her arms crossed, her face a mix of worry and exasperation. What's going on with you? You've been off since that first call. I hesitated, the weight of Thomas's secret pressing against my ribs. I wanted to tell her, God, I wanted to, but the words stuck, tangled in the chaos of my thoughts. Instead, I let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through my hair. Your dad's face when he said 50 million. Did you see it? He thinks he's untouchable. Her lips twitched, a reluctant smile breaking through. He always does. But yeah, he was peacocking pretty hard. She stepped closer, her hand resting on my chest, grounding me. You sure that's all it is? No. It wasn't. But I nodded anyway, pulling her into a quick hug, her warmth cutting through the storm in my head. For now, I murmured, my voice muffled against her hair. Let's just get through this. She laughed softly, the sound easing the knot in my chest, and for a moment, it was just us, two outsiders against the Harper's gilded machine. But as we turned back toward the dining room, I felt the shift settle into me, permanent and unyielding. Thomas had lit the fuse, and whether I liked it or not, I was holding the match. Bill Harper didn't know it yet, but the game had just changed, and I was done playing the pawn. The velvet curtains of the alcove brushed against my sleeve as Emily and I stepped back into the dining room, the weight of Thomas's revelation still pulsing in my veins like a second heartbeat. The air felt different now, thicker, charged, as if the chandeliers overhead were humming with the secret I carried. My eyes darted to the Harper's table, and there they were, unchanged yet utterly transformed in my mind. Bill sat at the head, his broad shoulders squared, his glass of Bordeaux catching the light with every lazy swirl. Margaret murmured something to Claire, her smile tight and practiced, while Daniel slouched with that same careless grin, oblivious to the bomb ticking beneath the surface. I wasn't the same man they dismissed an hour ago, and the thought sent a shiver of defiance down my spine. Emily's hand lingered on my arm as we approached, her touch a quiet tether to the chaos swirling in my head. She didn't know, couldn't know, not yet. But her presence steadied me, a reminder of why I was still here, why I hadn't bolted the second Thomas hung up. We slid back into our seats, the leather creaking under me, and I felt Bill's gaze snap to me like a hawk spotting movement in the grass. His smirk was still there, sharp and unyielding, but now it looked brittle, like a mask I could shatter if I pressed hard enough. Everything all right? He asked, his tone deceptively casual, the words curling around me like smoke. You two looked cozy out there. Just needed a breather, Emily said, her voice smooth but edged with steel. She squeezed my knee under the table, a silent signal to keep my cool. You know how overwhelming family can be. Bill chuckled, a low rumble that set my teeth on edge. Oh, I know. Family's a hell of a thing, full of surprises. His eyes flicked to me, lingering just long enough to make my skin prickle. Did he suspect something? Or was I projecting shadows onto his arrogance? Before I could respond, the waiter arrived with dessert, a towering confection of chocolate and cream that looked more like art than food. The distraction gave me a moment to breathe, to shove down the urge to blurt out everything Thomas had said. I stabbed at the plate with my fork, the clink of metal against porcelain loud in my ears, and tried to focus. $50 million. The Carter Foundation. My uncle wasn't just some small-time do-gooder, he was a player, a shadow king pulling strings I didn't even know existed. And I was his eyes in this room, his knife in the dark. Margaret broke the silence, her voice bright and brittle. Bill, tell them about the development plans. Now that the loan's through, it's all coming together, isn't it? Bill leaned back, his chest puffing slightly, and I seized the opening. Yeah, I said, keeping my tone light, curious, like I was just another awestruck outsider. 50 million's a big move. What's the play, more high-rises downtown? Or something bigger? His eyes narrowed, just a fraction, and I felt a jolt of satisfaction. He took a slow sip of wine, buying time, then set the glass down with a deliberate thud. Bigger, he said, his voice all gravel and confidence. Mixed-use complex, offices, retail, luxury condos. Whole damn block on the east side. Harper Development's putting its name on something permanent. Permanent, I echoed, nodding like I was impressed. My mind raced, filing away every word. Thomas needed this, needed to know what Bill was planning, how deep the loan tied him to the foundation. That's ambitious. Must have taken some serious backing to pull off. Bill's smirk widened, and he leaned forward, elbows on the table, his presence filling the space like a physical weight. Takes connections, James. The right people in the right rooms. You don't get 50 million on a handshake and a prayer. _connections_. The word hung there, and I felt the air shift again, sharper this time. My pulse hammered against my ribs, but I kept my face steady, forcing a grin. Guess I wouldn't know. My world's more chalkboards and grading papers than boardrooms and big checks. Daniel laughed, a sharp bark that cut through the tension. Stick with us, Jimmy. You might learn a thing or two. The nickname grated, but I let it slide, my eyes locked on Bill. Maybe, I said, tilting my head. Who's the muscle behind it? Big bank? Private fund? Bill's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, and I saw it, the first real crack. He waved a hand, dismissive, but the gesture felt forced. A foundation, actually. Carter Foundation. Good people. They see the vision. The name hit me like a punch to the gut, and I froze, my fork clattering against the plate. The room tilted, the edges blurring as Thomas's voice roared back, asterisk they don't even know who's holding the leash star. My uncle's foundation. My family's name. Bill Harper was sitting there, gloating over a deal he thought he'd mastered, and he had no idea the Carters, asterisk my asterisk Carters, were the ones pulling the strings. Shock coursed through me, cold and electric, followed by a surge of something raw and dangerous. Anger. Defiance. Power. Emily's hand tightened on my knee, her voice a harsh whisper. James? I blinked, snapping back, and realized the table had gone still. Bill's eyes were on me, sharp and unblinking, and Margaret's smile had vanished. Claire smirked into her dessert, but Daniel sat up, his grin fading. They'd all heard it, the clatter, the pause, and they were waiting for me to crack. Sorry, I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. Dropped my fork. Carter Foundation, huh? Never heard of them. Bill's gaze lingered, searching, and I held my breath. Not surprised, he said finally, leaning back with a shrug. They're low-key. Focused on community impact, schools, housing, that sort of thing. Surprised me too, but their money spends like anyone else's. _schools _ housing _ My mind spun, piecing it together. That sounded like Thomas, quiet, deliberate, always talking about giving back. But 50 million? That wasn't quiet. That was a goddamn empire move, and I'd spent my whole life blind to it. My uncle wasn't just a player, he was a titan, and he'd kept me in the dark. Why? Interesting, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Didn't peg them for the type to bankroll luxury condos. Bill's eyes flashed, a flicker of irritation breaking through his calm. It's an investment, he said, his tone sharpening. They get returns, we get the project. Everyone wins. Everyone wins, I repeated, letting the words hang, my mind racing. Not everyone. Not if Thomas had his way. Not if I twisted the knife like he'd asked. The thought sent a thrill through me, dark and uncharted, and I hated how good it felt. Emily shifted beside me, her voice cutting through the haze. Sounds like a lot of risk, Dad. What if it flops? Bill turned to her, his smirk softening into something almost paternal. It won't. I don't lose, Em. You know that. The certainty in his voice grated against me, stoking the fire in my chest. He didn't lose, not yet. But I had something he didn't. A name. A secret. A lever I could pull if I dared. My hands trembled under the table, and I clenched them into fists, the nails biting into my palms. I wanted to shove it in his face, asterisk the Carter Foundation's mine, you smug bastard asterisk, but I swallowed it down, the words burning like acid on my tongue. Margaret clapped her hands, breaking the tension with a laugh that sounded forced. Oh, let's not bore James with business talk. He's probably dying to get back to his chalkboards. The dig landed, but it didn't sting like it would have before. I smiled, tight and controlled, and leaned back in my chair. Not at all, I said, meeting Bill's gaze head-on. I'm learning a lot tonight. His eyes narrowed, just enough to tell me he'd caught the edge in my voice. Good. Let him wonder. Let him squirm. The room felt smaller now, the air crackling with something unspoken, and I knew I'd crossed a line, not enough to show my hand, but enough to rattle him. Emily's hand found mine again, her grip fierce, and I clung to it, anchoring myself against the storm building inside me. Dessert dragged on, the conversation shifting to safer ground, Claire's latest shopping spree, Daniel's golf game, but my mind was elsewhere, spinning through the wreckage of Thomas's revelation. The Carter Foundation wasn't just a name on a check. It was my blood, my legacy, and I'd been too naive to see it. Anger simmered beneath my shock, anger at Thomas for hiding it, at myself for missing it, at Bill for thinking he could bury me under his wealth and walk away clean. When the plates were cleared, Bill leaned forward again, his voice all business once more. Speaking of the foundation, I've got a call with their director tomorrow. Thomas Carter. Sharp guy, knows his numbers. We'll hammer out the details. My heart stopped, then slammed back to life, pounding against my ribs. Thomas. My uncle. Bill was about to sit across from him, negotiate with him, and he had no idea the man on the other end was tied to me, the nobody he'd spent all night dismissing. Shock gave way to a twisted surge of glee, and I fought to keep it off my face. Thomas Carter, I said, my voice calm despite the chaos inside me. Sounds like a name to remember. Bill nodded, oblivious. He's a force. Keeps a low profile, but the man's got pull. You do well to meet people like that, James. Might open some doors. The irony hit me like a brick, and I nearly laughed. Open doors. Thomas had already kicked one wide open, and I was standing in the threshold, deciding whether to step through. Maybe I will, I said, my tone light, but my eyes locked on his. You never know who's closer than you think. Bill's smirk faltered again, and this time it didn't come back. He stared at me, searching, and I felt the weight of his suspicion settle over the table. Emily tensed beside me, her breath catching, but I didn't flinch. The game had shifted, and for the first time all night, I wasn't the one on the ropes. The dining room buzzed around me like a hive ready to swarm, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse, a relentless drumbeat drowning out the clink of glasses and the Harper's polished chatter. Bill's last words, asterisk you never know who's closer than you think asterisk, hung in the air, my own voice echoing back at me, taunting me with how close I'd come to tipping my hand. His eyes were still on me, narrowed and glinting under the chandelier's glow, searching for the thread he'd pulled to unravel me. I held his stare, my jaw tight, my hands clenched beneath the table until my knuckles ached. I wasn't unraveling, not yet, but the pressure was a vice, squeezing tighter with every breath. Emily's chair scraped beside me, a sharp sound that cut through the haze. Excuse us, she said, her voice clipped, rising before anyone could protest. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in with a force that snapped me out of my daze. We need a minute. Bill raised an eyebrow, his smirk twitching like he was about to say something cutting, but Margaret laid a hand on his wrist, her smile thin and placating. Let them go, dear. Young love needs its moments. The words grated, dripping with condescension, but I didn't care. I stood, my legs unsteady, and followed Emily as she marched toward the restaurant side exit, her heels clicking against the hardwood like gunfire. The air shifted as we pushed through the heavy glass door, the February night slamming into me, cold, sharp, a slap of reality after the suffocating warmth inside. The alley stretched out before us, narrow and shadowed, flanked by brick walls slick with frost. The faint hum of traffic drifted from the street beyond, but here it was just us, the silence between us thick and electric. Emily spun to face me, her breath fogging in the dim glow of a single street lamp overhead. Her auburn hair whipped across her face in the wind, and her green eyes blazed, wide with a mix of fury and fear. What the hell is going on, James? Her voice cracked, raw and urgent, cutting through the night like a blade. You've been a ghost since that second call. Don't lie to me, not now. I opened my mouth, but the words stuck, tangled in the mess of shock and anger still churning inside me. The alley felt smaller, the walls closing in, the cold seeping through my jacket and into my bones. I ran a hand through my hair, pacing a tight circle, my boots crunching against the gravel. Thomas's voice roared back, asterisk they don't even know who's holding the leash asterisk, and I felt it again, that jolt of disbelief, the weight of a truth I couldn't unsee. My uncle wasn't just a man with a checkbook. He was a force, a shadow king, and I'd been blind to it my whole life. James, Emily snapped, stepping closer, her hands balling into fists at her sides. Talk to me. You're scaring me. I stopped, turning to her, and the sight of her, fierce, vulnerable, demanding, cracked something loose. It's Thomas, I said, my voice rough, barely above a whisper. The Carter Foundation, asterisk my asterisk Carter Foundation, just approved your dad's $50 million loan. He doesn't even know it's us. Her eyes widened, her lips parting as the words sank in. What? She breathed, stepping back, her heels scraping against the pavement. Your uncle? The foundation? How do you not know this? I didn't, I shot back, the anger spilling out now, hot and jagged. He's been playing me, playing us, this whole time. I thought he ran some small-time charity, schools, food banks, that kind of thing. Not this. I gestured wildly, as if the alley could hold the enormity of it. Not $50 million. Not power like that. She stared at me, her breath coming fast, fogging in bursts. And he called you, twice, tonight? Why? To use me, I said, the words bitter on my tongue. He wants to know what your dad's thinking, how he's playing it. He told me to twist the knife, To twist the knife. My voice broke, and I turned away, slamming a fist against the brick wall. The pain flared, sharp and bright, but it didn't touch the storm inside me. Emily grabbed my arm, pulling me back, her grip fierce. Hey, no. You don't get to shut down on me. What does that even mean? Twist the knife how? I don't know. I snapped, spinning to face her. I don't know what he's after, revenge, control, some damn game I didn't sign up for. But your dad's in there, gloating like he owns the world, and Thomas, he's got him by the throat, and I'm stuck in the middle. Her face softened, but the fire in her eyes didn't fade. She stepped closer, her hands sliding up to grip my shoulders, anchoring me. You're not in the middle alone, she said, her voice low, steady despite the tremor in it. I'm here. We figure this out together. I wanted to believe her, God, I did, but the weight of it all pressed down, crushing. Your dad, I said, my voice dropping. He's going to meet Thomas tomorrow. He has no idea who he's dealing with. And me, he's been tearing me apart all night, and now I've got this power over him, and I don't know what to do with it. Emily's hands tightened, her nails digging into my jacket. You don't have to do anything yet, she said, her tone fierce. We process this. We think. But James, don't let them turn you into something you're not. Not my dad, not Thomas. Her words hit hard, slicing through the chaos. I looked at her, really looked at her, her flushed cheeks, her defiant stare, and felt a flicker of something solid amid the wreckage. She was right. I wasn't their pawn, not Bill's, not Thomas's. But the anger still burned, mingled now with a hunger I couldn't shake. The Harpers had dismissed me, belittled me, and now I held a piece of their world in my hands. The thought of shoving it back in Bill's face, watching that smirk crumble, lit a fire I didn't know I had. Before I could answer, footsteps echoed from the mouth of the alley, heavy and deliberate. My stomach dropped as a shadow loomed, broad and familiar, the street lamp catching the glint of silver hair. Thomas. My uncle stepped into the light, his overcoat billowing slightly in the wind, his face carved with that same quiet intensity I'd known since I was a kid. But now it looked different, harder, sharper, like a blade unsheathed. James, he said, his voice low, carrying over the gravel. Emily. We need to talk. Emily stiffened beside me, her hand sliding down to grip mine, and I felt the air shift again, heavier now, suffocating. What are you doing here? I demanded, stepping forward, my voice raw. You can't just drop this on me and show up like some damn ghost. Thomas didn't flinch. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady and unyielding. I didn't plan it like this, he said, his tone calm but edged with something urgent. But you're in it now, kid. And I need you to understand what's at stake. Understand? I laughed, a harsh, broken sound. You've lied to me my whole life, Thomas. What's at stake? Your money? Your power? What? He shook his head, his jaw tightening. Not mine. Ours. The Carters. This isn't about wealth, it's about what we stand for. The Harpers build empires to step on people like us. I've spent years making sure we hit back, quiet like, where it hurts. That loan? It's a chokehold. And you're the one who can tighten it. I stared at him, my chest heaving, the cold biting into my lungs. His words sank in, heavy and inescapable, people like a star. The small-town kid with calloused hands, the teacher scraping by, the nobody the Harpers sneered at. Thomas wasn't just playing a game, he was waging a war, and he'd handed me the weapon. But it didn't feel righteous, not yet. It felt dirty, tangled in a web of deceit I hadn't asked for. Emily's voice cut through, sharp and defiant. And what about James? You drag him into this without a heads up, without a choice? That's not standing for anything, that's using him. Thomas's eyes flicked to her, a flicker of respect breaking through his calm. Fair point, he said, nodding slightly. But choice is a luxury we don't have right now. Bill Harper's meeting me tomorrow, and he'll figure it out soon enough, James's name, our name. When he does, this blows up. I need you both ready. Ready for what? I demanded, my voice rising. To lie? To fight? To what? Destroy him. To decide, Thomas said simply, his gaze locking on mine. Who you are in this. What you'll do with it. I can't make that call for you, James. But I can tell you this, the Harpers don't give a damn about people like us unless we make them. The alley fell silent, his words hanging between us, heavy as the frost on the bricks. Emily's hand tightened in mine, her breath fogging beside me, and I felt the pressure crest, a wave ready to break. Decide. Who I was. A teacher. A Carter. A man with a knife in his hand and a target in his sights. The anger flared again, hot and fierce, but beneath it was something colder, doubt, fear, a moral edge I wasn't sure I could cross. I looked at Emily, her face pale but resolute, then back at Thomas, standing there like a general rallying his troops. The Harpers waited inside, oblivious, their world of glass and gold teetering on a fault line I could crack wide open. The choice loomed, sharp and unyielding, and I knew there was no stepping back, not from this, not from them, not from myself. The alley stretched around us like a frozen canyon, the brick walls glistening faintly with frost under the dim street lamp. Thomas's shadow loomed larger than it should have, his overcoat billowing faintly in the biting February wind, his face etched with a resolve that made my stomach twist. His words, decide who you are slammed into me, heavy as the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and the air felt too thin, too cold, like it couldn't hold the weight of what he'd just dropped in my lap. Emily stood beside me, her hand still gripping mine, her breath fogging in tight bursts as she stared at my uncle with a mix of defiance and disbelief. The hum of the Magnolia Room seeped faintly through the walls behind us, a distant reminder of the world we'd left inside, a world that was about to collide with this one. I took a step forward, my voice shaking but sharp. You don't get to do this, Thomas. You don't get to hide this, whatever this is, for years, then show up and tell me it's my fight. My fists clenched at my sides, the cold stinging my knuckles where I'd slammed them against the brick. What am I supposed to do? Walk back in there and tell Bill Harper his empire's a house of cards? That I've got the match? Thomas didn't flinch. His eyes, dark and steady, locked on mine, and for a moment, I saw something flicker there, regret, maybe, or just the weight of too many secrets. You don't have to say a damn thing, he said, his voice low and rough, cutting through the wind. Not yet. But he's meeting me tomorrow, James. He'll put it together, your name, my name, the foundation. When he does, he'll come for you. For her. He nodded toward Emily, and my chest tightened, a fresh wave of anger surging through me. Don't drag her into this, I snapped, stepping closer, close enough to see the lines carved deep into his face, the strain he'd been carrying. This is your war, not ours. Emily's grip tightened, pulling me back just enough to keep me grounded. He's already in it, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She turned to Thomas, her eyes blazing. You should have told him. Years ago. He deserved that much. Thomas nodded, a slow, reluctant dip of his head. You're right, he said, and the admission caught me off guard, softening the edge of my fury just enough to let the shock seep back in. I kept it quiet because I didn't want this life for him, for any of you. The Carter Foundation started small, James. Your dad and I built it to help people, not to play these games. But the Harpers of the world, they don't stop. They take, and they crush, and they don't care who's underfoot. I had to fight back. And now it's bigger than me. Bigger than you, I repeated, the words tasting hollow. I turned away, pacing the narrow alley, my breath fogging in jagged clouds. The street lamp cast long shadows across the gravel, twisting my silhouette into something I didn't recognize, a man caught between rage and revelation, teetering on a ledge I hadn't even known existed an hour ago. My whole life, I'd seen Thomas as the quiet one, the uncle who showed up with a toolbox to fix our leaky sink, who sent me books about the Civil War because he knew I loved history. Now he stood there, a titan in a worn overcoat, handing me a legacy I wasn't sure I wanted. Emily stepped closer, her boots crunching softly, and placed a hand on my chest, stopping me mid-stride. James, she said, her voice softer now, cutting through the noise in my head. Look at me. I did, and her green eyes held mine, fierce and unwavering. You don't have to be him. You don't have to fight his war. But you need to know what you're walking into. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat burning. She was right, she always was, but the truth didn't make it easier. Bill Harper's smug face flashed through my mind, his voice dripping with condescension all night, asterisk not much money in it, though asterisk, and now the thought of him sitting across from Thomas tomorrow, oblivious to the noose around his neck, sent a dark thrill through me. I hated it, hated how good it felt, how the anger twisted into something sharper, something like hunger. Revenge? Justice? I didn't know the difference anymore. Before I could answer, the glass door behind us swung open with a sharp creak, and Bill Harper stepped into the alley, his broad frame filling the space like a storm rolling in. The street lamp caught the silver in his hair, the glint of his cufflinks, and his eyes, those hawkish, unyielding eyes, swept over us, landing on Thomas with a flicker of recognition that turned my blood to ice. Well, damn, Bill said, his voice a low drawl, thick with amusement but laced with something harder. Thomas Carter, as I live and breathe. Didn't expect to see you slumming it out here. His gaze slid to me, then Emily, and back to Thomas, piecing it together faster than I'd hoped. Family business, huh? The air went still, the cold biting deeper as the pieces clicked into place. My heart slammed against my ribs, and Emily's hand tightened in mine, her nails digging in. Thomas didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there with that same calm intensity, like he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Bill, Thomas said, nodding slightly, his tone neutral but weighted. Good to see you too. Just catching up with my nephew. Nephew, Bill echoed, his smirk widening as he turned to me, his eyes sharpening. James Carter. Thomas Carter. Hell of a coincidence, don't you think? He stepped closer, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel, and the alley shrank, the walls pressing in. You've been awful quiet about that family tree, son. The word, son hit like a slap, dripping with mockery, and I felt the anger flare hot and wild, drowning out the fear. Didn't think it mattered, I said, my voice low, steady despite the storm inside me. Not until tonight. Bill's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, and I saw it, the first crack in his armor. He glanced at Thomas, then back at me, his mind working, calculating. Until tonight, he repeated, rolling the words like he was tasting them. Funny timing, that. Right after I mentioned the Carter Foundation. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, James? The question hung there, a blade poised to cut, and I felt the weight of every eye on me, Bill's, Thomas's, Emily's. My mouth went dry, the truth clawing up my throat, but I swallowed it down, forcing a shrug. Just a name to me, I said, meeting his gaze. But it seems to mean a lot to you. Bill's eyes narrowed, searching, and for a moment, I thought he'd call my bluff. But Thomas stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. It's a name that's done a lot of good, he said, calm but firm. And it's backing your loan, Bill. $50 million worth. I'd say that's worth a conversation. The alley went silent, the wind dying down as Bill froze, his broad shoulders stiffening. His smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare as he turned to Thomas. You're telling me you're the Carter Foundation? His voice was low, dangerous, each word a step toward the edge. And this kid, he jerked his head toward me, he's what, your errand boy? He's my family, Thomas said, his tone unyielding, and the word hit me harder than I expected, *family star. And he's got nothing to do with this unless you make it that way. Bill laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that echoed off the bricks. Oh, I'll make it that way, he said, stepping closer, his presence looming over us all. You think you can sneak into my deal, Carter? Play me like some small-time mark? I don't care who he is to you, this ends tomorrow. That meeting? It's off. I'll find another lender, and you can take your foundation and shove it. My stomach dropped, but Thomas didn't flinch. You could, he said, his voice steady, almost amused. But the papers are signed. The money's locked. You walk away now, you're breaching contract, and I don't think your board's going to like that. Bill's face darkened, a storm brewing behind his eyes, and I felt the shift, the power tipping, the ground trembling beneath us. He turned to me, his gaze cutting through me like a blade. You knew, he said, his voice a growl. All night, sitting there, playing the poor teacher act while your uncle pulled strings. You've got guts, I'll give you that. I didn't know, I said, the truth spilling out before I could stop it, raw and ragged. Not until an hour ago. But yeah, I know now. He stared at me, his jaw tight, and I saw it, the shock, the disbelief, the slow burn of realization that he'd underestimated me, underestimated us. Emily stepped forward, her voice sharp and defiant. He's not your pawn, Dad. Neither am I. You don't get to rewrite this because you're mad. Bill's eyes flicked to her, softening for a split second before hardening again. Stay out of this, Em, he said, but there was a crack in his voice, a hint of something human beneath the steel. He turned back to Thomas, his smirk gone, replaced by a cold fury. You want a war, Carter? You've got one. But don't think your nephew's safe just because he's blood. He's in this now. The threat landed like a punch, and my chest tightened, fear and anger twisting together until I couldn't tell them apart. I wanted to fire back, to shove his words down his throat, but Thomas's hand landed on my shoulder, heavy and steady, stopping me cold. He's tougher than you think, he said, his voice quiet but lethal. And so am I. Bill didn't answer. He just stared at us, the alley stretching taut between us, then turned and stalked back toward the door, his broad frame disappearing into the restaurant's glow. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot, and the silence that followed was deafening. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, my knees trembling as the adrenaline drained away. Emily's arms wrapped around me, fierce and warm, and I clung to her, the cold biting into my skin. Thomas stepped back, his face unreadable, but his eyes held mine, steady and searching. You okay? He asked, his voice softer now, almost gentle. No, I said, the word rough and honest. But I will be. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. That's my boy. The alley felt bigger now, the walls receding as the shock settled into something solid, disbelief giving way to a grim resolve. Bill Harper knew. The game was up, the lines drawn, and I was in it, whether I wanted to be or not. But as Emily's warmth pressed against me, as Thomas's quiet strength anchored me, I felt something shift inside, a flicker of pride, a spark of defiance. I wasn't just a teacher anymore. I was a Carter. And whatever came next, I'd face it head on. The alley's cold lingered on my skin as Emily and I stepped back into the restaurant, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind us with a dull thud that felt final. Bill's shadow had vanished into the dining room's golden haze, but his words, *keys in this now*, clawed at me, sharp and unyielding, like a splinter I couldn't dig out. My boots echoed on the hardwood, each step heavier than the last, and Emily's hand stayed firm in mine, her warmth the only thing keeping me tethered. The hum of chatter and clinking glasses washed over us as we passed the Harper's table, empty now, save for a half-finished glass of Bordeaux and a crumpled napkin. They'd cleared out fast, leaving the wreckage of the night behind. I didn't say a word as we grabbed our coats and slipped out the front, the February air hitting me again, crisp and biting, clearing the fog from my head. Thomas had stayed in the alley, promising to meet me tomorrow. "We'll sort it out, kid," he'd said, his voice steady but laced with something I couldn't name. Regret, maybe. Or resolve. I didn't care. Not tonight. The drive home was silent, the city lights blurring past us, and Emily didn't push, just rested her hand on my knee as I gripped the wheel too tight, my knuckles white against the cracked leather. When we pulled up to my parents' house the next morning, the familiar sight of the sagging porch and peeling paint hit me differently. It wasn't just home anymore, it was a lie I'd lived in, a stage for secrets I'd never seen. The gravel crunched under my boots as I climbed out of the car, Emily trailing behind me, her green eyes flicking between me and the front door. My chest felt tight, like the air wouldn't fit, and I paused at the steps, staring at the faded welcome mat Mom had set out years ago. "Welcome. What a joke. You sure about this?" Emily asked, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the morning quiet. She stood close, her coat pulled tight against the wind, her auburn hair catching the weak sunlight. "No," I said, my breath fogging in front of me. "But I can't wait anymore." I pushed the door open without knocking, the hinges creaking loud enough to announce us. Inside, the house smelled like it always did, coffee and old wood, a faint trace of Dad's pipe tobacco lingering in the air. Mom was at the stove, her back to us, stirring something in a pot, her apron tied loose around her waist. Dad sat at the kitchen table, hunched over the newspaper, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. They looked so normal, so small, and for a second, I wanted to turn back, to keep them that way in my head. But then Mom turned, her face lighting up when she saw me, until she caught the look in my eyes. "James," she said, her spoon stilling, her smile faltering. "What's wrong?" Dad lowered the paper, his gray eyes narrowing as he glanced from me to Emily, then back. "You're early," he said, his voice gruff, like he already knew this wasn't a social call. I stood there, rooted to the linoleum, the heat from the stove pressing against my back. My hands clenched at my sides, the words I'd rehearsed all night tangling in my throat. "Why didn't you tell me?" I finally said, my voice low, rougher than I meant it to be. "About Thomas. About the foundation. About all of it." Mom's spoon clattered into the pot, and Dad's paper crumpled as he set it down, slow and deliberate. The kitchen went still, the ticking of the old wall clock loud in the silence. Emily stepped closer, her shoulder brushing mine, and I felt her strength steady me as the weight of their stares settled in. "What are you talking about?" Mom asked, but her voice trembled, and I saw it, the flicker of guilt in her eyes, the way her hands gripped the counter behind her. "Don't," I snapped, sharper than I'd intended, and she flinched. "Don't play dumb. Thomas told me everything last night. The Carter Foundation. $50 million. Bill Harper's loan. All of it. And you too," I pointed at them, my hand shaking. "You let me think we were nothing. Just a hardware clerk and a part-time bookkeeper raising a kid who'd never amount to much." Dad stood, his chair scraping back, his broad frame filling the small kitchen. "That's enough, James," he said, his tone hard, but there was a crack in it, a weariness I hadn't noticed before. "We didn't lie to you. We just didn't tell you everything." "Didn't tell me everything?" I laughed, a harsh, broken sound that echoed off the cabinets. "You hid a damn empire from me. Thomas said it's ours, the Carters. That it's about fighting back against people like the Harpers. And you let me walk into that dinner last night blind, let them tear me apart, when all along, my voice broke, and I turned away, staring at the faded wallpaper, the peeling corner I'd traced as a kid. "Why?" Mom stepped forward, her hands twisting in her apron, her eyes wet. "We wanted you to have a normal life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your dad and Thomas, they started the foundation after your granddad died. Small stuff at first, scholarships, food drives. Things we could manage. But Thomas, he kept pushing. He saw what men like Bill Harper did to people, how they took, and he wouldn't let it go. It grew, James. Bigger than we ever meant it to. Then why keep me out?" I demanded, spinning back to face her. "Why let me think I was less than them?" "Because you're not like us," Dad said, his voice steady now, cutting through the haze. He stepped closer, his calloused hands resting on the table, and I saw the years etched into his face, the weight of choices I'd never understood. "Thomas thrives on it, the fight, the power. I didn't. I wanted out. And your mom and I, we wanted you free of it. Free to be a teacher, to live quiet, to not have to carry this." I stared at him, my chest heaving, the anger draining into something colder, shock, maybe, or betrayal too deep to name. "Free," I repeated, the word tasting sour. "You think I felt free last night? Sitting there while Bill Harper sized me up like dirt on his shoe? You think I felt free when Thomas dropped this on me, told me to twist the knife?" Mom's hand flew to her mouth, a soft gasp escaping, and Dad's jaw tightened. "He shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low, laced with a fury I rarely heard. "That's not what we wanted." "But it's what I've got," I said, meeting his gaze, my own eyes burning. "And now I've got to figure out who I am with it." The kitchen fell silent again, the clock ticking on, relentless. Emily's hand found mine, her fingers threading through my own, and I clung to her, the only solid thing in the room. Mom wiped her eyes, stepping closer, her voice trembling but firm. "You're our son, James. That's who you are. Not some pawn in Thomas's game, not some weapon against the Harpers. You're better than that." "Am I?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, raw and ragged. Because last night, when Bill figured it out, when I saw his face, part of me wanted to shove it back at him. To make him feel small for once. And I don't know what that makes me. Dad's hand landed on my shoulder, heavy and warm, and I flinched but didn't pull away. "It makes you human," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Angry. Hurt. But it doesn't make you him. You get to choose, James. Always have." I looked at him, then at Mom, their faces soft and worn, and felt the storm inside me shift, not gone, but quieter, settling into something I could hold. They'd kept me in the dark, yeah, but not to hurt me. To protect me. And now the choice was mine, to carry the Carter name like a shield or a sword, or to set it down and walk away. I didn't have the answer yet, but standing there, with Emily beside me and my parents' honesty laid bare, I felt the first flicker of relief, fragile but real. 3 months later, the air was warm, thick with the scent of magnolias and fresh-cut grass. The backyard of Emily's family estate stretched out before me, a sea of white chairs and pastel flowers, the late May sun dipping low and painting everything golden. I stood at the altar, my tie loose around my neck, Emily's doing, her fingers brushing my collar with a smirk hours earlier, and watched her walk toward me, her white dress catching the light like a flame. Her green eyes locked on mine, fierce and steady, and the crowd faded away, the Harpers, my parents, Thomas, all of them nothing compared to her. The ceremony was quick, the vows simple, but every word felt like a hammer striking stone, carving something permanent. When I kissed her, the cheers erupting around us, I tasted salt and sunlight, and for the first time in months, the weight on my chest lifted, light as the breeze rustling the trees. The reception unfolded under a sprawling tent, lanterns swaying overhead, the hum of laughter and clinking glasses filling the night. I stood by the bar, a beer in hand, watching Emily twirl with her niece on the dance floor, her laughter cutting through the music. She'd fought for this, for us, every step of the way, through her father's threats and Thomas's shadow, and now here we were, married, whole. A hand clapped my shoulder, and I turned to find Thomas, his suit rumpled but his eyes bright, a glass of bourbon raised in his hand. "Hell of a day, kid," he said, his voice warm, softer than it had been in the alley. "She's good for you." "Yeah," I said, my gaze drifting back to Emily. "She is." He followed my look, then cleared his throat, stepping closer. "I owe you an apology," he said, and I tensed, surprised by the weight in his tone. "For dragging you in like that. I thought I was protecting you, keeping it separate, but I misjudged. You're a Carter, James, but you're not me. Never were." I nodded, slow and deliberate, the words sinking in. "I get it," I said, meeting his eyes. "But next time, tell me up front. No more surprises." He chuckled, a rough, honest sound. "Deal." Then he raised his glass higher, his voice carrying over the crowd as he turned to face them. "A toast." The music dipped, head swiveling toward us, and I felt the heat creep up my neck. Emily paused mid-twirl, her smile widening as she drifted back to my side, her hand slipping into mine. Thomas's gaze swept the tent, Bill and Margaret at their table, stiff but present, my parents near the edge, quiet and proud, the scattered faces of friends and family caught in the glow. "To James and Emily," Thomas said, his voice steady, resonant. "Two kids who know what matters, heart, grit, values that don't bend for money or power. They're building something real, something the rest of us could stand to learn from. To a life driven by what's right, not what's easy." The crowd erupted, glasses clinking, cheers rising, and I felt Emily's fingers tighten in mine, her breath hitching beside me. Bill's jaw tightened across the tent, his eyes flicking away, but I didn't care. Thomas's words weren't a jab, they were a line in the sand, a quiet defiance of the world the Harpers built, and I felt them settle into me, solid and true. As the music swelled again, Emily pulled me onto the dance floor, her arms wrapping around my neck, her body warm against mine. "You okay?" she whispered, her lips brushing my ear. I looked at her, then past her, to Thomas laughing with Dad, to Mom wiping her eyes, to the life stretching out ahead of us, and felt the last knot of doubt unravel. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady, a smile tugging at my lips. "I'm good." The night spun on, the lantern swaying, the magnolias rustling in the breeze, and I held her close, the weight of the past 3 months, anger, shock, pride, melting into something new. Not vengeance, not power, but purpose. I was a Carter, sure, but I was James, too, teacher, husband, man, and that was enough. For now, for always, that was enough.